The stories. What happened inside this mountain lodge will shock you. The guest log from that mountain lodge still sits in a plastic evidence sleeve with one page glued to another. Dispatch records show a routine welfare check, then a second call minutes later that changed everything. In early October of 2011, Tegan Rourke was 33 and worked as a county building inspector. That morning, Tegan planned to recheck a roof repair on a remote lodge above a winding forest road. The lodge stayed open year-round, but the owner only kept staff there on busy weekends. Tegan had done permits there before, and the place always felt quiet but harmless. The weather was clear, and the drive up took just under 2 hours from the county offices downtown. Tegan's county truck climbed through pine stands and bare rock, and the radio kept fading in and out. A printed work order sat on the passenger seat, with a note about leaks over the dining hall. Tegan expected a quick walkthrough, a few photos, and a signature from whoever was on site. At the turnoff, the lodge sign leaned slightly, and the gravel lot had only one vehicle parked. It was an older SUV with an out-of-state plate, and its driver window was cracked open. Tegan noted it in a small notebook because parked vehicles mattered in a rural inspection log. The lodge itself was a long timber building with a stone chimney and tall windows facing the slope. Tegan knocked at the front doors and waited, then tried again with a little more force. No one answered, and the doors were locked, which was unusual during posted open hours. Tegan walked around to the side entrance near the kitchen, where staff usually came and went. That door was also locked, but the deadbolt was not fully seated, like it had been rushed. Tegan called the owner's number from the permit file, and it went to voicemail after 4 rings. A text message sent, then stayed unread, and Tegan felt the first small pinch of worry. County rules allowed an exterior inspection without entry, but the leak note required a look inside. Tegan radioed the office, reported no contact, and said a second attempt would be made shortly. Tegan moved under the eaves and checked the roof line from the ground with binoculars. The shingles looked new over one section, and a gutter joint had been patched with sloppy sealant. A faint drip line stained the siding, and Tegan snapped photos with a work phone. Then a sound came from inside, a single thud that carried through the front windows. Tegan froze, listening, and heard nothing else for several seconds after that heavy impact. The lodge sat too far from neighbors for casual foot traffic, and no wind moved the doors. Tegan tried the front doors again, and this time the right door shifted a half-inch. It had been locked before, but now the latch gave slightly, like something inside pressed against it. Tegan stepped back and decided not to force entry, because welfare checks were not the county job. Still, the odd shift in the door made leaving feel wrong, like ignoring a smoke smell. Tegan called the sheriff dispatch line and requested a deputy to check the building. The call log later showed Tegan used calm language, but the dispatcher noted concern about possible injury. While waiting, Tegan walked back toward the SUV to see if someone was nearby in the lot. The SUV keys were not visible, and the seats were empty, but a paper map lay open on the dash. A small badge clip hung from the rearview mirror, the kind used for conferences or guided tours. Tegan could not read the name through the glass, but the plastic sleeve looked freshly printed. Tegan stood by the county truck and watched the lodge windows, expecting movement in the curtains. Nothing shifted, and the silence started to feel staged, like a room waiting for a cue. A second thud came, softer this time, followed by a faint scrape that lasted 2 seconds. Tegan raised the phone to record audio, then stopped, unsure if that would help later. Deputy Marlowe Kincaid arrived about 20 minutes later, alone in a marked unit. Marlowe was 41 and had worked patrol in the county for 14 years. He greeted Tegan, took in the locked lodge and the lone SUV, and asked what happened so far. Tegan explained the door shift and the sounds, then handed over the permit file contact number. Marlowe tried the front entrance, found the same slight give, and tested the handle carefully. The door opened 2 inches, then stuck, as if something heavy pressed it from the other side. Marlowe called out, "Sheriff's office! Anyone inside?" and waited for an answer that never came. He motioned Tegan to stay back, then reached around the gap with a flashlight. The beam caught a strip of carpet near the threshold, darkened by something that looked wet. Marlowe's posture changed, and he pushed the door harder, but it still would not swing fully. He stepped aside, drew a small pry bar from his kit, and worked the latch without splintering wood. The door gave another few inches, and the smell hit them both, sharp and sour like old water and metal. Marlowe backed out and called dispatch again, requesting a second unit and medical standby. The dispatch log reportedly shows his tone shifted from routine to urgent within that sentence. He then circled to the kitchen door, found it partially unseated, and eased it open with his shoulder. That entrance opened cleanly, and the two of them stepped into a dim hallway lined with framed photos. The lodge was colder inside than it should have been, like the heat had been off for hours. A small radio played faintly in the kitchen, but the volume was low, almost like it was meant to hide. Marlowe followed the sound toward the dining hall, moving slow and keeping Tegan behind him. The floorboards creaked, and a hanging light swayed slightly, though no air seemed to move. At the dining hall doorway, something blocked the opening from the far side. It was a chair tipped on its side, wedged against the door like a crude barricade. Marlowe pushed it away with his boot, and the doorway cleared enough to see the room. The tables were set for breakfast, but no food sat out, and the place looked paused mid-routine. Near the fireplace, a man lay on his back with one arm bent under him at an awkward angle. He wore a lodge, staff polo, and his face had bruising around one eye, older than a few minutes. Marlowe checked for response from a safe distance, then moved in and felt for a pulse. The man was cold, and Marlowe looked down at the floor beside him, where dried streaks ran toward the entry. Tegan stood in the doorway, trying not to stare, and focused on small details to stay steady. A lodge keyring lay near the man's hand, and one key was snapped clean in half. A thin line of clear fishing wire ran from the chair at the doorway to a table leg. It was tied tight, and Tegan saw it only because the flashlight glare caught its sheen. Marlowe followed the wire with his eyes, then cut it with a pocket knife to remove tension. He told Tegan to step back into the hallway, and Tegan did without arguing. He radioed dispatch again, and his short words suggested a deceased person and a possible scene. The radio response crackled, and for a moment, Tegan could not understand any of it through the static. While waiting for backup, Marlowe did a slow sweep without touching anything else. He checked the front entrance from inside and found the reason it would not open. A heavy rolling cart from the kitchen had been shoved against it, with towels stuffed under its wheels. The cart was positioned with care, like someone wanted the door to move just enough to tempt entry. The lodge office sat behind the front desk, and Marlowe could see light under its door. He tested the knob, found it locked, then noticed a second strand of wire at ankle height. That wire ran from the office door handle to a wall hook, like a tension trap. He stepped over it and stayed clear, then called out again to announce his presence. No one answered from the office, but a printer clicked once, then hummed as if waking. The sound was small, yet it made Tegan's stomach tighten, because it implied someone had been there. Marlowe kept his weapon holstered and used a mirror tool to look around the door edge. He saw no movement, then waited, like he was giving a hidden person time to make a choice. Backup arrived, along with a medic unit that stopped short when the scene was explained. Deputy Arden Sola joined Marlowe, and together they secured the lodge and kept Tegan outside. Tegan sat on a stone bench by the entrance, hands on knees, watching steam rise from their breath. From that spot, Tegan noticed something odd about the SUV. The rear hatch was not fully latched. When Arden checked the SUV, she did not open it right away, but photographed the gap first. Inside the hatch, a duffel bag sat open with folders, a portable recorder, and extra badge clips. The badges all carried the lodge name, with a line that read, Guest Services Volunteer Weekend. None of the badges had a photo, only a blank square and a printed first name that looked generic. Arden set the bag aside as possible evidence and closed the hatch gently, leaving it for investigators. Detectives arrived later that afternoon, and the lodge became a sealed scene with tape and logs. Tegan gave a formal statement, repeating details, and was asked twice about the fishing wire. Tegan described where it was tied and how it caught the flashlight glare, and the detective wrote carefully. They also asked about the earlier thuds, and Tegan admitted the second scrape sounded like furniture moving. The detectives found another staff member in an upstairs room, alive but disoriented and dehydrated. She was named Lorna Vess, 36, and worked as a front desk clerk during weekends. Lorna reportedly said she had been locked in the room and her phone had been taken. She remembered arguing with someone she thought was a guest, then a sting in her neck, then darkness. In the office, investigators found a laptop open to a guest reservation list. Several names were typed in, then deleted, then typed again, like someone kept changing the plan. A printed sheet sat in the printer tray, warm to the touch, listing check-in times for people who never arrived. The times were spaced exactly 15 minutes apart, and each entry used the same handwriting style in the notes field. They also recovered an audio recorder under the front desk, still running when it was found. The file timestamp matched the morning of the welfare check, according to later reports. It captured faint footsteps, the scrape of a cart, and a voice whispering a phrase twice. The phrase was hard to make out, but analysts later suggested it sounded like, "Keep them outside." Tegan was asked to review photos of the dining hall layout from earlier permit visits. Tegan noticed the tables were arranged differently than normal, leaving clear paths between doorways. The fireplace tools had been moved to the far wall, neatly lined up like they were counted. A single chair sat facing the front desk, centered, as if someone wanted a person to sit there. It was the kind of staging that looked normal until someone pointed out how deliberate it was. The dead man was identified as a seasonal employee hired 3 weeks earlier. His employment file listed only a local mailing address and a prepaid phone number. Investigators could not confirm prior work references, and the ID copy looked unusually clean. The medical examiner later ruled the death a homicide caused by blunt force trauma and delayed help. The report noted older bruises, suggesting the man had been struck earlier, then moved. Lorna, once stabilized, gave more details in a second interview that detectives treated as key. She recalled a guest who arrived the night before, claiming the lodge needed a safety inspection. He wore a lanyard badge that looked official, and he spoke with confident, practiced calm. He asked where the security cameras recorded and whether the front doors could be opened from inside. When Lorna questioned the request, he smiled and said, "It's a drill. The owner knows." That line sounded harmless in the moment, but it became important once detectives checked the owner's story. The owner insisted no drill was planned and no outside safety contractor had been hired. Phone records showed the owner received missed calls, but none were returned until late afternoon. He also admitted he rarely checked the lodge on weekdays, and he trusted staff to handle small issues. That gap in oversight gave someone space to run a plan without interruption. The biggest break came from the guest services volunteer badges found in the SUV. A detective called the lodge booking vendor and asked about the volunteer weekend program. The vendor said no such event existed, and the lodge had never used that wording in promotions. The badge design, however, matched a template used by a nearby conference center. It was a generic print layout, the kind anyone could buy online and customize in minutes. Investigators then pulled archived security footage from a gas station down the mountain. The footage reportedly showed the older SUV arriving the previous evening, then leaving briefly, then returning. A man in a ball cap carried a rolling cart cover, like the ones used for banquet linens. He moved with familiarity, like he knew exactly what tools he needed and where to place them. He also wore a lanyard, and the badge swung forward once, showing a blank square where a photo belonged. The twist did not come from a hidden identity reveal, but from a detail Tegan almost dismissed. During the first statement, Tegan mentioned the front door shifting, as if something pressed it. A detective later asked Tegan to walk through that moment again, step by step, without guessing. Tegan realized the door shift happened after the first thud, not before, which meant timing mattered. It suggested someone moved the cart to create the tempting gap only after hearing Tegan outside. That led detectives back to the audio recorder under the front desk. They enhanced the section between the thud and the door shift, filtering out the radio static. A clearer sound emerged, the rolling squeak of rubber wheels, followed by a breathy whisper. The phrase was not "keep them outside" after all, it was "get them outside," repeated with urgency. It sounded like a command to someone else, not a reminder to self. From there, the theory shifted in a way that surprised even the investigators on the case. They had assumed a lone intruder staged traps to prevent entry, then escaped out a back route. Instead, the evidence pointed to two people, one inside controlling access, another upstairs managing Lorna. The dead employee likely resisted, got injured, and became a problem to move out of sight. The person at the front desk then tried to lure an outsider in, but keep them from seeing too much. The chair, barricade, and fishing wire were not meant to harm an intruder. They were meant to slow them down, trip them lightly, and force them to look at the floor. If someone stumbled, they would focus on their footing, not on the office door or the front desk area. The rolling cart at the front door was positioned to let the latch click, making it seem unlocked. That tiny invitation would draw a person to the wrong entrance, while the real exit stayed clear elsewhere. A second exit did exist, but it was not a secret tunnel or anything dramatic. It was the service stairwell that led to a ground-level storage door behind the lodge. That door had no alarm contact, because it was listed as an interior-only access in old plans. Tegan's permit photos from years earlier showed the door, but no one had updated the security list. The person who planned this had likely studied those plans or worked a similar building before. In the weeks that followed, the case did not end with a neat arrest and a televised confession. Investigators identified a suspect connected to a string of small frauds involving fake inspections. Witness statements placed him near the lodge, and a partial fingerprint matched on a badge clip. Still, the second person remained unknown, and no clear motive beyond control and deception was proven. Official statements used careful language, noting the investigation remained open and evidence was incomplete. Tegan returned to the county office and filed the inspection as incomplete, with notes that felt unreal. For months after, Tegan kept replaying the moment the door shifted, like the building itself breathed. It was not a ghost story, and no one claimed anything supernatural happened in that lodge. It was just a plan, built from small choices, simple tools, and a confidence that nobody would look closely. Tegan learned that the scariest part was how ordinary everything looked until the pattern appeared. The stories. Locals warned about this abandoned cabin for years. The cabin sat back in the pines, and locals kept warning newcomers to stay away from it. Those warnings sounded like small-town drama until a maintenance worker found fresh boot prints in the dust. Kellen Brody was 36 and worked for the county parks department as a trails and facilities technician. On a cool weekday in early fall, he planned to swap a rotted signpost near a service road. The task was simple: drive out, set the post, snap a photo for records, then head back. He had done the same loop dozens of times, and he expected a quiet morning again. The service road cut through dense trees, and the radio lost signal not far from the highway. Kellen parked near a locked gate, then carried tools and a new sign down the old spur. Half a mile in, the trees opened around a clearing that should have been empty and flat. Instead, a cabin sat there, weathered boards and a sagging roof like it had been dropped from another decade. The cabin was not on his route sheet, and it was not in the park asset list either. Kellen had heard of it because people complained about trespassers and late-night fires near the clearing. A clerk at the front desk had once rolled her eyes and called it the cabin story again. Kellen never cared, because his job was signs, gates, and broken benches, not local legends. He set the new signpost first, then took a quick photo with his work phone for the file. When he turned back toward the cabin, he saw something that pulled him off his schedule. A line of boot prints crossed the clearing, dark and crisp in pale dirt, heading straight to the front steps. The prints looked fresh, and the last rain had been 2 days earlier. Kellen told himself it could be hikers, but the cabin sat outside any marked trail network. He walked closer, scanning for trash, smoke, or anything that could start a brush fire. At the base of the steps, he noticed a second set of prints that ended and did not return. The ground was soft enough to hold detail, yet there was no matching path back to the tree line. The front door hung slightly open, and the gap looked too clean for a place that abandoned. Kellen stopped on the bottom step, then called out with the polite voice of a worker in public space. He said, "County maintenance, anybody in there?" No one answered, and the cabin gave back only a dull creak from settling wood. He should have backed out and called a ranger, yet the missing return prints felt wrong. Kellen stepped onto the porch, and the boards complained under his weight. Near the threshold, he saw a smear on the doorframe, like a hand brushed it while entering. The smear was dark, but it could have been mud, and he could not tell from the angle. Kellen pushed the door wider with his glove, then leaned inside without fully crossing the threshold. The air smelled old, like damp paper and stale smoke, but it was not the sharp stink of a new fire. Light slipped through cracks in the boards, and dust floated in thin lines across the room. On the floor, a scatter of dry leaves formed a rough arrow pointing toward the back wall. His eyes adjusted, and he saw why locals might warn people away even without a ghost story. A narrow trapdoor sat near the hearth, and its edges were scraped clean, as if opened often. Next to it was a coil of nylon rope, pale and newer than anything else in the cabin. Kellen felt a cold pinch in his stomach, because rope did not belong in a forgotten structure. He backed out, set his tools down, and pulled his phone from his vest pocket. The service bar was still empty, but he could record what he saw for the supervisor later. He took photos of the prints, the rope, and the trapdoor, keeping each frame steady and clear. Then he tried calling again, and the call failed before it could ring. Kellen did not want to go under the cabin alone, and he knew that was a hard rule. Still, he could not stop thinking about the second set of prints that ended at the steps. He decided to do one more thing that stayed on the safe side of his job. He would check around the outside for a second exit, then leave and drive for signal. He walked the cabin perimeter, watching his footing on loose stones and roots. Behind the structure, a shallow trench ran along the foundation, filled with needles and old cans. Halfway down the back wall, the trench deepened and something metal glinted under dirt. Kellen crouched, brushed aside debris, and found a small square vent with a modern latch. The vent was nearly hidden, and it looked recently cleaned, which made it stand out. He did not open it, but he photographed it, then marked the spot in his phone notes. He typed short lines, cabin clearing, fresh prints, rope by trapdoor, vent with latch. He added the time, because details mattered when someone later asked what he had seen. By the time he returned to the gate, the quiet felt heavier than it should. Kellen loaded his tools, started the truck, and drove until his phone picked up a weak bar. He called his supervisor, then the regional ranger office, and he left a careful message. He said there were signs of activity at an abandoned cabin, and he was not going back alone. An hour later, a ranger named Sloane Maris met him at the gate with a second vehicle. Sloane was in her 40s, practical, and tired in the way of people who cover too much territory. She listened without interrupting, then asked for the photos and Kellen's exact walking route. Kellen handed over the phone, and she studied the prints and rope with a tight jaw. Sloane said the cabin was outside the official park map, but it still sat on public land. She also said locals called it the Long Cedar Place, and complaints came in every few months. Most reports were bonfires, dumped furniture, and teens daring each other to stay overnight. She did not mention ghosts, and her tone made it clear she did not want that part. They walked back together, and Kellen felt better with another set of footsteps beside his own. At the clearing, Sloane took her own photos, then measured the prints with a small ruler card. She pointed out that the deep heel marks suggested someone carrying weight going in. Then she paused at the steps, and she made a quiet sound, like a breath caught. There were two sets of prints now, and one set overlapped Kellen's earlier path. The newer set was lighter, and it came from the opposite edge of the clearing. It went to the porch, then turned and vanished near the front door, just like the other set. Sloane stared at the ground, then looked up at the trees as if expecting movement. She told Kellen to stay back, and she drew her radio even though the signal was poor. She tried the channel anyway, then switched to a second frequency and got only static. Kellen watched her shoulders tense, and he knew she was thinking about someone still inside. She stepped onto the porch, called out, and got the same silence Kellen had heard. Sloane did not go straight to the trap door, and that choice surprised Kellen. Instead, she moved to the side wall, then crouched near a warped window frame. She slid a small camera wand through a gap, and her face tightened as she watched the screen. Kellen could not see the display, but he saw her swallow, then pull the camera back slowly. She said there was a second door inside, not an exterior door, but a door that should not exist. She said it looked like it led into the wall, and the edges looked recently painted. Kellen blinked, because paint in that cabin would be like a bright flag in a swamp. Sloane told him to keep his distance, then she stepped into the cabin at last. Kellen stayed on the porch, angled so he could see the doorway and still watch the clearing. Inside, Sloane moved with careful steps, and the cabin groaned under her boots. He heard her say, "Ranger office. Identify yourself if you're here." Then he heard a faint click, like a latch turning, followed by a low drag across wood. Sloane backed out fast, and her expression had changed from caution to certainty. She said, "Someone is in there, and they have a way out you don't see." She told Kellen to return to the gate and wait, but he did not want to leave her alone. Sloane considered him for a moment, then told him to watch the tree line and stay silent. They held their positions for several minutes, and the only sound was wind through needles. Kellen's eyes kept returning to the boot prints that ended without a return path. He tried to picture how a person could step onto the porch and then disappear. Then he noticed something he had missed earlier, a thin line in the dirt beside the steps. The line was straight, like the track of something dragged, and it ran toward the side of the cabin. Kellen pointed it out, and Sloane nodded without taking her eyes off the doorway. She whispered, "That's a cover being pulled. Prosit." She moved along the porch edge, then dropped to one knee near the foundation. Near the porch corner, she found a plywood panel sunk into the ground like a loose hatch. Its top was dusted with dirt, but the corners were clean, like hands had lifted it often. Sloane used her knife to pry it, then held still, listening before she raised it fully. A cold draft rose from the opening, carrying the damp smell of soil and old concrete. Sloane kept her voice level and loud, and she called down into the dark. She said, "This is a ranger. Come up slowly and show your hands." For a few seconds, nothing happened, and Kellen felt his pulse thump in his ears. Then a voice answered, shaky and young, "Please, don't let him come back." A teenage boy climbed out, maybe 16, thin, covered in dust, and shaking hard. He looked at Kellen like he was trying to decide if he was real. Sloane guided him away from the hatch, then asked where the other person was. The boy swallowed, then said, "He's inside, and he locks the wall door." Sloane moved fast after that, and she told Kellen to stay with the boy. Kellen sat the kid on a rock and gave him water from his bottle. The boy held it with both hands, and his fingers would not stop trembling. He said his name was Rafi, and he had been working odd jobs with a man from a nearby town. Rafi said the man promised cash for hauling scrap out of the cabin and cleaning the clearing. Rafi also said the man called it a storage place, and he acted like he owned it. When Rafi asked why the cabin was not on any map, the man told him not to worry. Then, the first time Rafi saw the trapdoor, he realized it was not just a cabin. Rafi said there was a basement room under the cabin, with shelves and sealed plastic tubs. He said there were old tools, canned food, and stacks of papers wrapped in trash bags. He also said there were cameras, not new ones, but working ones with a small monitor. The man watched that monitor, and he told Rafi the cabin was safer than anywhere else. Kellen asked, "Safer from what?" Rafi looked toward the cabin, then lowered his voice like the trees could listen. He said people used to come here to hide, and they never left clean. He added that locals warned about it, because strangers always seemed to vanish around it. Kellen did not want to push a frightened kid, but the details sounded too organized for trespassing. He asked how Rafi got out, and Rafi pointed to the hatch under the porch. He said the man showed it once, bragging about how nobody could follow footprints. He said there was a tunnel that ran into the hillside, then split behind a false wall inside. While they talked, Sloane returned, breathing hard, and she looked like she had seen enough. She said the cabin was rigged with simple alarms, fishing line, and bells in the dust. She said the wall door led to a narrow corridor, and it was built with newer lumber. The corridor ended at the vent Kellen found, and it opened into a shallow ravine under brush. Sloane said the man was gone, and the only sign was a fresh scrape in the corridor dust. She called for backup again, and this time the radio caught a weak signal. She gave coordinates in plain language and asked for deputies and a medic for the kid. Then she told Kellen they needed to document everything before weather or animals erased it. They did it step by step, slow enough to be boring, because boring kept mistakes away. Sloane recorded a short video on her body camera, narrating each feature they found. Kellen took still photos with timestamps, then saved copies to a separate work folder. They photographed the rope, the trapdoor, the false wall seam, and the hidden hatch track. Sloane asked Rafi to describe the basement, and she wrote it down word for word. She asked about the papers, the tubs, and the cameras, and whether any names appeared. Rafi said the papers had dates, mostly older, like 1980-something and 2002. He said there were maps with circles and receipts from hardware stores and burner phones without service. He also said he saw a stack of cassette tapes in a milk crate, all labeled with weekdays. Sloane took that seriously, because tapes meant recordings, and recordings meant evidence. She and Kellen entered together, and they kept their hands visible on camera the whole time. In the basement, they found the shelves Raffi described, and the monitor that still had a faint glow. The tubs were real, and the tapes were real, and the labels were written in careful block letters. They did not play the tapes there because they had to preserve the chain of custody. Still, Sloan photographed each label, and Kellen read them quietly as if they were fragile. Monday check-in, Tuesday check-in, Wednesday check-in, and so on, over and over. At the bottom of the crate was a single tape labeled Visitors with no date at all. There was also a binder, thick, with plastic sleeves holding printed pages. Kellen saw a page that looked like a call log, with times and short notes beside numbers. He saw phrases like gate open, truck passed, and lights in clearing, written without emotion. Sloan flipped to another page and found a list of names, but none were full names. They were nicknames like Skiff, Halo, and Brick, and each had a dollar amount beside it. Sloan said, "This is not a dare cabin." Kellen nodded, and he felt his mouth go dry as he looked at the tidy shelves. It felt like someone had been running a business, and the cabin was just the front. Raffi kept saying the man watched people, and those tapes made that claim feel more believable. When deputies finally arrived, the clearing filled with engines and voices, and the spell broke. Sloan briefed them, then handed over the tape crate and binder with careful signatures. A medic checked Raffi, and he did not have visible injuries beyond scrapes and dehydration. Raffi said he had been down there only overnight, but he thought it had been longer. Over the next week, Kellen got pulled into interviews and paperwork he never expected. He met with a county investigator who asked him to walk through every minute of his morning. He provided his photos, his notes, and his call attempts, and he signed statements twice. He also learned from Sloan that the cabin had a real history, and it was uglier than rumors. Reportedly, the cabin had belonged to a private hunting club decades earlier, then burned partially and was rebuilt. After that, it became a meeting spot for all kinds of people who wanted to avoid attention. An archive clerk found old complaints about shouting and headlights in the clearing dating back to 1996. There were also missing property reports, like tools and bikes, that clustered around the same months. The warnings locals gave were not supernatural, and they were not just about trespassing. They were about a place that made it easy to disappear for a night, or a week, or longer. The tunnel explained the missing footprints, and the false wall explained the vanishing act. What surprised everyone was how long the setup had lasted, and how calmly it was maintained. The twist came from the tapes, once they were reviewed in a controlled lab. According to the investigator, several tapes captured short conversations, not confessions, but transactions and threats. One tape, the visitor's tape, included a voice that matched a former county contractor. That contractor had worked on culverts and drainage years earlier, and he had access to equipment and permits. The case tightened when purchase records matched lumber and vent hardware to a job billed as erosion control. The hidden vent was installed under cover of that work, and it blended into real maintenance. It meant the cabin was not just an accident of history, it was updated with official-looking paperwork. That was why it stayed off radar, because it hid behind normal processes and boring invoices. Kellen kept thinking about the moment he saw the prints that did not return. He realized the warning was never about the cabin itself, it was about the system around it. A place can be rotten and still look ordinary, especially when someone keeps it swept. When he drove past the gate later, the clearing was empty again, and the cabin was finally boarded up. Raffi was placed with relatives, and his statement became a small hinge in a bigger investigation. Sloan kept her tone steady whenever Kellen asked how it ended, because cases like that rarely end clean. She did say the main suspect vanished before arrest, and that alone kept the locals uneasy. Still, the tunnel was sealed, the tapes were secured, and the cabin stopped being useful. Months later, Kellen replaced the signpost again, because weather never stops doing its own work. He stood at the edge of the clearing and listened to the ordinary forest sounds. The cabin looked smaller with boards across every opening, like a mouth forced shut. Kellen understood why people warned others for years, even if they never knew the exact reason. He walked back to his truck, and he did not glance over his shoulder this time. Some places earn their reputation the slow way, through patterns people notice without proof. This one earned it through careful planning and through a hidden door that erased footsteps. And for once, the warning finally matched the truth. even if the truth arrived late. The stories. No clue at the lake. Dispatch logs surfaced. The last official report said there was no clue at the lake, just a missing man and bad weather. Years later, dispatch logs surfaced, and the timeline stopped making sense for anyone careful enough. Rhett Dobbins was 38 and worked as a water systems technician for a small county utility. He drove a white service truck, carried a clipboard, and liked days that stayed predictable. On a cool weekday in early fall, he had one simple goal before lunch. He needed to check a pump station near a public lake and swap a faulty pressure sensor. The lake sat outside a modest town in the upper Midwest, surrounded by pines and gravel pull-offs. It was not wilderness, but it was quiet enough that voices carried across the water. Rhett arrived mid-morning, parked near the pump shed, and texted his supervisor that he was on site. The supervisor replied with a thumbs up, and the workday moved forward like it always did. Rhett walked the short path to the shed, unlocked the metal door, and stepped inside with his tool bag. He logged the starting readings, took a quick photo for the maintenance file, and shut off the breaker. The sensor swap was routine, and the only real hazard was a slip on wet concrete. He finished, re-energized the line, and wrote the new reading on the clipboard. A couple anglers were nearby, and they gave him a casual wave from the shore. Rhett nodded back, then walked toward his truck to file a quick update. That was the last time anyone could say they clearly saw him acting normal. At 11:17, a 911 call came in from the lake parking area. The caller said a utility truck was running and no one was around it. The dispatcher asked if anyone was hurt, and the caller said they could not see anyone at all. The call ended with a promise that a deputy would check it out. A deputy arrived about 15 minutes later and found Rhett's truck with the engine off. The keys were still in the ignition, and the driver door was not fully shut. His tool bag was missing, his phone was not on the seat, and his clipboard was gone. There was no blood, no torn clothing, and no obvious struggle in the gravel. Search teams came that afternoon, and they treated the lake like the first suspect. Divers checked the shallow edge, then the deeper basin near the dam. K-9 teams ran the tree line, then the trail that wrapped the far shore. No one found a dropped phone, a torn glove, or a boot print worth keeping. The next day, rain moved in and smoothed the sand along the water. By the end of the week, the official summary used the same cold phrase repeatedly. No clues located, no witnesses, and no further leads at this time. Rhett's sister-in-law, Maris Lawton, did not accept that ending. She was 41 and worked as a claims adjuster, which made her patient and stubborn. She kept a folder at home with every note she could get, even if it was thin. She believed details mattered, especially the boring ones people forgot. Maris started with the basics, and she requested the public incident report. It arrived with bland language, a few times, and a list of responding units. The times looked clean, almost too clean, like someone had copied them from memory. She asked for the original dispatch logs, and she was told they were archived. It took months of polite calls and several formal requests before she received anything useful. A clerk sent her scanned printouts from the communications center, marked with faded stamps. The pages showed call times, unit updates, and short notes typed in a hurry. Maris read them at her kitchen table and felt a slow chill in her stomach. The report said the first call was at 11:17 and the deputy arrived at 11:32. The dispatch logs showed something else, a call at 10:46 from the same lake lot. That earlier caller reported a man lying near the truck, not moving, near the driver door. The dispatcher asked if the man was breathing, and the caller said they could not tell. That call did not appear in the public report, and it was not mentioned in the summary. The logs showed it as cleared with no response, which made no sense at all. There was also a short update at 11:03 from a unit listed as unavailable. It said, checked area, vehicle present, no contact, returning to service. Maris read those lines again and again, trying to picture what they described. If someone saw a man down at 10:46, then where did that man go? If a unit checked the area at 11:03, why did the deputy arrive later? It felt like the lake had been searched for a story that was not the real one. She did not accuse anyone out loud, at least not yet, because she needed proof. So she built a careful timeline and called anyone who might have been there. She started with the anglers who had spoken to investigators, then moved outward. Most people forgot small details, but a few remembered things they had not been asked. One angler recalled a dark SUV parked 2 spaces over, idling for a long time. He said the driver never got out, and the vehicle left fast when a county car rolled in. Another person remembered a woman with a dog walking past the pump shed looking uneasy. She told Maris she heard a short horn honk, then a voice say, "Hey, over here." Maris asked if the voice sounded like Rhett, and the woman said she could not be sure. She said it sounded close, like it came from the lot, not from the water. She also said the horn honk did not sound like a normal car horn. It sounded sharper, like a truck air horn tapped once, then cut off quickly. Maris then requested weather history and learned the rain began later after the first search. That meant tracks could have survived at 10:46 if anyone had bothered to look. She drove to the lake herself and walked the lot, measuring distances with her steps. From the pump shed door to the truck was less than a minute at a normal pace. She found the one spot where gravel gave way to a thin strip of packed dirt. It was a place where a heel could leave a mark, especially if someone stumbled. She also noticed a small service access road behind a line of brush and a gate. It was barely visible from the lot, but it led to a maintenance yard a mile away. Maris asked the county if any cameras covered that road, and she got a flat no. But the utility district had a gate sensor that logged openings, because it tracked equipment access. After more calls, a tired supervisor agreed to check the old logs from that day. He called back and said the gate opened once at 11:08, then again at 11:12. Rhett's work truck was still at the lake when the deputy arrived at 11:32, so something else opened that gate. Something authorized or something that forced it. Maris asked if any utility trucks had the same gate fob, and the supervisor hesitated. He said a contracted maintenance crew had a shared fob for emergency repairs. The name of the contractor was on a dusty invoice, and Maris tracked down the owner. He said his crew was not scheduled at the lake, and he had no reason to be there. Still, he admitted one worker had been terminated weeks later for falsifying timesheets. The worker vanished from town, and no one seemed eager to remember his face. Maris went back to the dispatch logs and focused on the unit marked unavailable. It was listed with a call sign that did not match the deputy who wrote the report. She asked a retired dispatcher about the call sign, and he recognized it right away. It belonged to a county investigator who sometimes used an unmarked vehicle for court runs. That investigator was not assigned to Rhett's case, at least not on paper. Yet the logs showed he checked the scene at 11:03 and cleared it. Maris requested his activity record for that day, and the county denied it. They said it involved personnel privacy and could not be released. So Maris looked for a different path, one that did not require their permission. She filed a request for radio audio, not reports, because audio was often treated differently. Weeks later, she received a file that included the 10:46 call. The caller sounded nervous, and the dispatcher sounded calm, maybe too calm. The caller said there was a man down, and the dispatcher asked for a description. The caller said, "Work clothes, utility logo, face down," and then he stopped talking. A second voice came through faintly, closer to the phone, saying, "Hang up now." The line clicked, and the dispatcher marked it as caller disconnected. Maris played that section again and wrote down every sound she could hear. There was a low rumble in the background, like a diesel engine idling nearby. There was also one sharp horn tap, the same detail the dog walker described. Then the second voice, which did not sound panicked, sounded firm and controlled. Maris brought the audio to a friend who did sound work for local commercials. He isolated the background and said there were at least 2 engines, not one. One sounded like a pickup, and the other sounded like a larger truck. He could not identify the vehicles, but he confirmed it was not just wind. That pushed Maris to a harder idea, that Rhett did not vanish into the lake. It suggested he was moved, quickly, while a few people watched from a distance. It also suggested someone with authority arrived early and chose to keep it quiet. She needed one more piece, something that tied the gate openings to real vehicles. A month later, Maris found it by accident in Rhett's old laptop. The utility used a simple field app that synced photos when service was available. Rhett's supervisor had pulled the official photos, but the system kept hidden drafts. One draft photo was timestamped 10:43, and it was taken from inside the shed. The photo showed Rhett's tool bag on the floor and the open door behind him. In the narrow slice of sunlight outside, a pair of boots stood in the doorway. The boots were not Rhett's, and the pants above them were not utility uniform. The shadow made it worse, because the person was standing still like they were waiting. Maris showed the image to the angler who remembered the dark SUV. He said the boots matched what he saw later, near the lot by the idling vehicle. He said the person was tall, with a heavy jacket, and moved like they were used to giving orders. He also said the person did not look wet, like someone who had been near the water. Maris took everything she had and went to a state agency that reviewed cold cases. She did not claim murder, and she did not accuse a named person in writing. She presented a timeline conflict, an undocumented early response, and an audio anomaly. She also presented the gate logs and the draft photo with the boots in the doorway. The agency agreed to ask questions, quietly at first, the way institutions protect themselves. They interviewed the retired dispatcher, then the deputy, then the investigator with the odd call sign. At first, everyone said the same thing, that the day was chaotic and records got messy. But the investigator could not explain why he marked the scene checked at 11:03. His explanation shifted, then tightened, then broke when the audio was played. He said he went to the lake on an unrelated matter, and he saw a truck. He said a man matching Rhett's description looked unwell, then got into another vehicle. He claimed the man said he was fine, and the investigator left, trusting his choice. Maris asked one question through the agency, and it landed like a stone. If Rhett was fine, then why did the caller say he was face down and not moving? No one had a good answer, and silence became its own kind of confession. Months later, a quiet administrative report acknowledged that some records were incomplete. It did not use dramatic words, and it did not admit wrongdoing in clean terms. It said a welfare check occurred before the formal response, and it was not documented properly. It also said the original caller could not be identified because the number was not captured. But the real payoff came from a small detail in the dispatch system itself. The logs stored more than text, and they kept a hidden field for tower routing. A technician found the 1046 call did not route through the lake tower. It routed through a tower closer to the maintenance yard, miles away from the lot. That meant the call was not made from the parking area like everyone assumed. It meant someone called in the report while already moving away from the lake. The voice saying, "Hang up now," made more sense in that light. It sounded like a command from someone sitting in the same vehicle. Investigators searched the maintenance yard and its old storage sheds, and they found something small. Behind a row of pallets, they found Rhett's clipboard, warped from moisture, covered in grime. The handwriting was still there, and the last line showed the sensor reading. The line ended mid-word, like the pen stopped when a hand was grabbed. They also found his phone case nearby, cracked, with no phone inside. The phone was never recovered, and neither was Rhett, at least not publicly. The case became a kind of proof without closure, a hard object that should not exist there. It told a story that the lake never could because the lake was the wrong stage. Maris learned that some stories are built to end quickly, because quick endings are tidy. A lake is an easy answer, and bad weather is a convenient excuse. But dispatch logs do not care about convenience, and old systems remember what people forget. When those logs surfaced, the lake stopped being a mystery and became a decoy. Rhett's name stayed on a plaque at the utility office, and his job was filled by someone new. The pump shed still hummed, the water still moved, and the public still fished the shoreline. Maris still kept her folder, but the pages were no longer blank and hopeless. They were heavy with proof that the world can hide truth, then accidentally hand it back. The stories. Paramedic who broke protocol after the storm. The run sheet said the call never happened, but 3 witnesses remembered the ambulance anyway. The medic who signed it broke protocol, and the storm was only part of the reason. In early September of 2019, Reeve Donlin was 39 and worked as a paramedic for a county EMS service. He lived in a small river town in the Midwest, where storms tore up trees and power lines every summer. That morning, the remnants of a hurricane had drifted inland, dumping rain hard for hours. By noon, the river spilled into streets, and the dispatch center started stacking calls like plates. Reeve showed up for a 12-hour shift with dry socks, extra gloves, and a calm face. His partner, Talia Mendez, was 27 and a brand new EMT who still checked everything twice. They stocked the truck, ran their radio check, and waited in the bay with doors open. The supervisor told crews to stage on high ground and avoid floodwater. No exceptions today. Reeve nodded like always, but his eyes stayed on the weather map taped to the wall. He had worked enough storms to know the map never showed the small disasters. Their first calls were simple: a fall in a dark stairwell, a diabetic who ran out of insulin. They moved slow because debris made every street feel like a maze. Around 4:30, the radio crackled with a priority tone that made Talia sit up straight. Dispatch gave an address near the river, then stopped and corrected it to a cross street. The dispatcher's voice sounded tight, like she had been arguing with someone off mic. The note said, "Possible trapped person, caller unsure, water rising." The supervisor came on next and repeated the standing order about not entering flood zones. Reeve keyed up and asked if fire was en route for water rescue support. The supervisor said resources were thin and crews should not self-deploy into danger. Reeve acknowledged, then stared at the tablet, reading the caller number and name. The caller name matched someone Reeve recognized from a prior overdose call, a man named Kester Vale. Kester lived in a rental house near the river with a porch that sagged like a tired jaw. Reeve remembered Kester as loud, scared, and protective of his younger sister. That sister, Marlon Vale, had asthma and a heart condition, according to old chart notes. Reeve also remembered the last crew found their smoke detectors missing. Talia asked if they should stage at the edge and wait for fire, like they were told. Reeve said yes, but he turned the wheel toward the river anyway, taking the shortest route. They stopped where the pavement dipped into brown water and the barricade floated sideways. A neighbor waved both arms from a driveway, yelling something that the rain swallowed. Reeve got out, boots sinking in mud, and asked where the caller was. The neighbor pointed at the Vale house, and the porch light blinked like a weak heartbeat. Water covered the front steps, and the yard looked like a shallow lake. Kester stood at a window, banging on the glass with his palm, face pale and furious. Reeve walked closer until the water reached his knees, then stopped and assessed. He could see Marlon inside, sitting on the couch, shoulders hunched, breathing fast. Talia stayed by the truck, scanning for drifting debris and watching the water level. Reeve called fire dispatch on the radio and asked again for a rescue team. The dispatcher said units were tied up and an estimated arrival time was unknown. Kester slammed the window again and shouted, "She can't breathe! She's turning gray!" Reeve looked at Marlon's lips, and even through glass, he saw a bluish tint. Protocol said, "Wait, do not enter moving water, do not compromise the crew for one patient." Reeve knew the rule, and he had repeated it to rookies a dozen times. He also knew asthma did not politely pause while resources got sorted. He called his supervisor and described what he saw, then asked for permission to enter. The supervisor said no and added that any entry would be considered a direct violation. Reeve ended the call and took one more look at Marlon's posture and the panic in her eyes. He told Talia to keep the truck in place and to call for law and fire again. Talia asked if he was serious, and Reeve said, "Stay dry and keep eyes on me." Then he waded forward, one step at a time, feeling the push of water on his thighs. He reached the porch rail, grabbed it, and pulled himself to the door. Kester opened it fast, and the smell inside hit like wet carpet and old cigarettes. Reeve told Kester to move back, then stepped into ankle-deep water on the living room floor. Marlon tried to speak, but her words came out broken and thin. Reeve knelt beside her, checked her pulse, and listened to her lungs. The wheeze was tight, and her oxygen level on the finger clip was dropping fast. He reached for his kit and realized the bag was still with Talia at the truck. Reeve swore under his breath and asked Kester if they had any inhalers. Kester ran to a kitchen drawer and returned with a rescue inhaler with a cracked cap. Reeve checked the label and saw it was expired, but it was better than nothing. He coached Marlon through 2 puffs, then watched her chest keep fighting. Her breathing did not ease, and her hands started to tremble in a way Reeve did not like. He needed a nebulizer treatment and oxygen, and he needed it now. He asked Kester where the nearest high spot was, and Kester pointed toward a back window. Behind the house, the ground rose slightly, but the walkway was narrow and clogged with branches. Reeve decided to move Marlin out, even if it meant carrying her through water. He called to Talia through the open door, and his voice sounded small in the rain. Talia ran closer with the jump bag and the oxygen kit held over her head. She stopped at the waterline and looked at Reeve like she wanted to argue. Reeve told her to stay at the edge and hand him what he asked for. Talia slid the oxygen tubing and mask across the porch rail like a lifeline. Reeve put the mask on Marlin, opened the valve, and watched her shoulders loosen slightly. He set up the nebulizer with albuterol, hands steady even as water bumped his knees. Marlin's eyes stayed locked on him, desperate and trusting in a way that felt heavy. Kester hovered close, asking if she was dying, and Reeve told him to help by staying quiet. The treatment ran, and the wheeze softened, but it did not clear the way Reeve expected. That was when Reeve noticed bruising on Marlin's neck, faint fingerprints under damp hair. He did not react outwardly, but his mind filed it away with a cold click. He asked Marlin what happened before the breathing got bad, and she glanced at Kester first. Marlin said, "I slipped," then looked down, then added, "I fell in the hallway." Reeve asked where, and Marlin pointed toward a door that led to the back room. Reeve told Kester to keep holding the oxygen, then moved toward the back room carefully. He opened the door and saw a mattress on the floor, a space heater, and a chain lock on the inside. The chain lock was mounted high, like it was meant to keep someone in, not keep someone out. There was also a phone on the mattress with a cracked screen, and it was powered off. Reeve stood still, hearing the rain outside, and felt the call shift in his gut. He returned to Marlin and asked if she had called 911 herself. Marlin shook her head, then nodded, then said, "I tried, but it wouldn't work." Kester cut in and said the cell towers were down, and that was why he called from a neighbor. Reeve asked the neighbor's name, and Kester hesitated before answering. Talia caught that hesitation, and her eyes flicked to Reeve with a silent question. Marlin's breathing improved enough to move, so Reeve chose the back window exit. He and Kester carried her together, Reeve supporting her shoulders and Kester lifting her legs. They stepped into water again, pushing through branches, and Reeve kept talking to Marlin steadily. Talia followed along the higher edge, keeping oxygen flowing, watching for slips. They reached the small rise behind the house, where the mud was thick but not submerged. Reeve radioed that they had a patient and needed a clear route to transport. The supervisor replied with a clipped tone, asking why the crew entered the flood zone. Reeve said, "Patient was failing, no rescue resources available," and kept his voice controlled. The supervisor told them to return to staging and wait for fire to assist extraction. Reeve looked at Marlin, saw her lips still tinted, and decided he was done waiting. He loaded Marlin onto the stretcher on the high ground, then angled it toward a neighbor's driveway. The driveway sloped upward to dry pavement, and it was passable if they moved fast. They rolled the stretcher, wheels bouncing, while Kester ran ahead, clearing branches. Talia stayed near the head of the stretcher, keeping the mask sealed, face tense and focused. They got Marlin into the ambulance and started toward the hospital without lights to avoid debris panic. On the way, Reeve documented everything out loud so the dash audio captured it. He said arrival time, patient condition, oxygen levels, treatment given, and response observed. He also said noted bruising on neck, pattern consistent with grip, keeping the tone neutral. Talia stared at him, surprised, then looked back to Marlin, who had drifted into shallow sleep. Reeve called the receiving hospital and gave a report, including the bruising and the locked room. At the hospital, staff moved Marlin into a bay, placed monitors, and started additional breathing support. A nurse asked Kester to wait outside, and Kester argued until security stepped in. Reeve watched Kester's eyes, calculating and angry, then watched him step back too quickly. Talia whispered, "That didn't feel right," and Reeve nodded without looking at her. He finished the electronic chart, then paused at the signature line. Protocol violation meant the chart would draw attention, and attention meant questions about the house. Reeve had a choice, and he made it in a quiet, uncomfortable way. He entered the call as a different location, the dry driveway, not the flooded home. He left out the chain lock detail, and he described the bruising as possible injury from fall. Talia saw the entries and asked why he was softening it, and Reeve said, "Trust me for now." Back at the station, the supervisor called Reeve into an office and shut the door. He said the crew had endangered themselves and the truck, and the county could face liability. Reeve did not argue about the water, because the facts were the facts. He said the patient would have died if they waited, and he meant it. The supervisor said the run sheet looked clean enough, then asked who told Reeve about the address. That question landed wrong, like the supervisor cared more about blame than care. Reeve said dispatch gave it, and the supervisor said dispatch records were being audited. He warned Reeve not to freelance during a declared emergency, then dismissed him with a cold stare. Outside, Talia waited, and she asked if they were fired. Reeve told her no, but he said they needed to keep their own notes. Reeve went home and opened a notebook he kept for odd calls, writing the timeline carefully. He wrote the door chain detail, the powered-off phone, and Kester's hesitation about the neighbor. He also wrote that the supervisor seemed too eager for the chart to look tidy. The next day, he called an old friend who worked in hospital administration off the record. The friend said Marlon was stable, but she asked to speak to someone without family present. That was when the story cracked open into something larger than a storm call. According to a nurse statement later filed, Marlon said Kester had been keeping her inside. She reportedly said he took her phone, locked the back room, and used fear to control her. She also reportedly said the storm was his excuse because no one would come quickly. The nurse called social services, and law enforcement opened a separate inquiry. Reeve's run sheet, however, did not match the nurse timeline, and that mismatch mattered. A week later, Internal Affairs pulled radio traffic, dispatch logs, and the ambulance GPS history. They noticed the truck entered a restricted flood zone and stayed there for 17 minutes. The supervisor claimed he was never told the patient was in distress, which contradicted the recorded call. Reeve requested the audio, and when he heard it, he caught something that made his jaw tighten. There was a gap in the supervisor's radio response, like a clipped section, not just static. Reeve asked dispatch for the raw recording, not the stitched file used for review. A dispatcher named Cora Helvey met him in a coffee shop, careful and nervous. She said she was not supposed to share anything, but she hated what was happening. Cora said the supervisor had direct access to the recording system during emergencies. She also said he sometimes cleaned up audio when crews got complaints. Reeve did not record Cora, but he wrote down what she said, time and date included. He then requested a public records copy through the county clerk, using the proper process. The response came back with a note that certain files were exempt due to personnel review. That answer did not deny the files existed, and it did not confirm they were intact. Reeve kept pushing, not loudly, but steadily, the way he handled stubborn insurance forms. Meanwhile, detectives interviewed the neighbor who owned the driveway where Marlon was loaded. The neighbor confirmed Kester ran to his house and demanded to use his phone. He also said Kester was already soaked, like he had been in the water before calling. The neighbor said he heard shouting inside the Vale house earlier, before the worst rain. Those details showed up in witness statements, and they lined up with what Reeve suspected. The twist came from something small, and it came from Talia's attention to details. She remembered the cracked inhaler Kester handed over, and she remembered the pharmacy label. The label had Marlon's name, but it had a refill date from 2 months earlier. That meant Marlon had not been cut off from care, at least not entirely. It also meant someone was controlling her access in a way that looked normal on paper. Talia visited the pharmacy after her shift and spoke to a technician she knew from school. The technician said Kester picked up Marlon's meds most months, and he signed for them himself. He also asked for her records once, claiming insurance problems after a storm claim denial. That detail sounded like nothing, until Reeve connected it to his own job history. Reeve had inspected a roof on Kester's street the previous year and denied part of a claim. Reeve pulled his old claim notes and found a photo of the Vale house from that earlier visit. In the photo, the back window had bars that were not in the neighborhood norm. The report also mentioned smoke detectors missing, which could be another control tactic. Reeve realized Kester might have recognized him, then used the storm chaos to create leverage. The flood zone was not just danger, it was cover for a staged crisis. Reeve brought that information to detectives, along with his notebook and the official run sheet. He admitted he altered the chart, and he explained why he thought it mattered for safety. He said he feared the supervisor would bury the locked room detail, and he was partly right. Detectives requested the ambulance dash audio, and the unedited file included his spoken notes. That audio captured the bruising observation clearly, and it matched the timestamps. When the county finally released the raw radio file under legal pressure, the gap was obvious. Experts later said it looked like a manual edit, not a transmission drop. The supervisor was placed on leave, then later resigned before a formal hearing concluded. No one publicly called it a cover-up, but the paperwork language was careful and pointed. Reeve was disciplined for the protocol breach, but he kept his license after review. Kester was charged in a separate case, based on Marlin's statements and corroborating evidence. The storm did not cause the bruises, and it did not install a chain lock on a bedroom. Reeve's choice to enter the water was still a violation, and he accepted that fact. But his larger break from protocol was quieter, the choice to keep notes beyond the system. Those notes helped unwind what the storm tried to hide. Months later, Reeve returned to that same river road on a dry afternoon. The Vale house looked smaller in daylight, and the porch rail had been replaced. Reeve did not go up to the door, and he did not need to. He sat in his truck for a minute, then drove away, thinking about rules and reality. In the end, the storm was loud, but the real danger was the silence people edited in. The stories. What happened inside this roadside diner will shock you. The incident became a training story in 2 counties because the footage looked ordinary until the last minute. It happened at a roadside diner off a long desert highway, and nobody agreed on what they saw. Dorian Kessler was 37 and worked as a commercial refrigeration tech for grocery stores and small restaurants. On a Tuesday in late spring, he drove east through high desert to replace a failing walk-in cooler motor. He had a work order, a parts box, and a plan to be home before dark. The diner was the only open place for miles, so he stopped for coffee first. The building was low and sunburned, with a buzzing sign and a gravel lot full of dust. Inside, the air smelled like fryer oil and lemon cleaner, and the booths stuck to the skin. A waitress named Maris Sloan was on shift, and she looked tired but alert. Maris was 42 and worked nights and mornings because the diner never fully closed. Dorian ordered black coffee and eggs, then checked his phone for the address again. Maris slid the plate down and asked what brought him out so far. He said he fixed coolers, and he was there to keep someone from losing a whole freezer. She nodded like she had heard that story 100 times, then glanced toward the kitchen door. A cook called something he could not make out, and Maris answered without turning around. Dorian noticed a small camcorder behind the register, aimed at the dining room. The diner did not feel dangerous, but it felt watched in a way he could not explain. A man in a windbreaker sat at the counter and kept his hands in his pockets. 2 truckers shared a booth, and they spoke low like they did not want attention. Dorian ate fast, then went to pay, because he wanted to start work before heat rose. As he stood at the register, the power flickered once, and the lights dimmed for a second. The buzzing sign outside changed pitch, like the voltage dipped and snapped back. Maris frowned and tapped the register screen. Then the printer spit a blank slip. She sighed and said, "Not again. It did this yesterday, too." Dorian offered to look because voltage drops were his whole life. Maris led him through the swinging door into the kitchen, and the noise got louder at once. Fans rattled in a vent hood, and an old freezer clicked like a bad relay. The cook was a broad man named Keenan Rourke, and he looked about 50. Keenan said the back hallway light had been pulsing, and the storage cooler was warm. Dorian opened his parts box, then crouched by the breaker panel near the dish area. He checked the main feed with a tester, and the numbers jumped more than they should. The panel cover was newer than the rest of the kitchen, and the screws looked recently handled. Dorian asked when the panel was replaced, and Keenan shrugged without looking at him. Maris said the owner did it after a break-in back in 2019. Dorian noticed her eyes stayed on the hallway that led to the back offices. The hallway was narrow and dark, with a mop bucket halfway blocking the path. A door at the end had a keypad, which felt strange for a place this small. Dorian pointed at it, and Maris said it was the office and storage for payroll. She said the owner did not like people back there, not even staff. Dorian nodded and went back to the panel, but he kept thinking about that keypad. He traced the flicker to a loose neutral and a corroded lug, which was simple and annoying. While he tightened the connection, a muffled thump came from the back hallway. Keenan paused with a pan in his hands, and Maris held her breath for a beat. Dorian asked if someone was in the office, and Maris said, It is probably the ice maker. The thump came again, and this time it sounded closer, like it was against the hallway wall. Dorian stood and wiped his hands, then said he would check the ice machine anyway. Maris stepped in front of him, and her voice stayed flat as she said no. Keenan kept his eyes down, but his jaw tightened like he was chewing a secret. Dorian took a step back, because the tension felt wrong for a loose wire. He said he would just finish the panel, then leave them to it. The lights steadied after his fix, and the kitchen fans settled into a smoother hum. Maris thanked him too quickly, then walked him back toward the dining room. As they passed the hallway, Dorian saw the keypad light blink, then go dark again. He also saw a thin strip of fresh paint along the doorframe, not matching the older walls. He filed it away as odd, then returned to the register to pay for his breakfast. The windbreaker man at the counter had turned to watch them, and his eyes looked red-rimmed. When Dorian set cash down, the man spoke softly, without turning fully around. He said, "You should not be back there. It is not safe." Dorian asked what he meant, and the man shook his head like he regretted speaking. Maris snapped, "He is leaving, and you are done talking in here." Dorian took his receipt, and the printer finally worked again, as if it waited for him. Outside, the heat hit his face, and the lot looked emptier than before. He walked to his van, and he noticed a second security camera under the eave. It was angled toward the back door, not the customers, which felt deliberate. He started the engine, then hesitated, because the warning from the counter stuck to him. Dorian drove around the building like he meant to find the service entrance for the cooler job. Behind the diner was a fenced area with stacked crates and a rusted shed. He saw the back door, and near it was a fresh set of tire tracks in soft dirt. The tracks were narrow and deep, like a small truck had backed up recently. He also saw a dent in the door, low and wide, like something heavy hit it. He told himself it was none of his business. Then he heard a short burst of sound. It was not a shout, more like a clipped yelp that cut off fast. Dorian killed the engine and listened, and the desert silence made the sound feel louder. He walked toward the fence line, staying near his van, and called out, "Everything okay?" No one answered, but he heard a faint scraping, like a chair dragged across concrete. Dorian pulled his phone and started recording, mostly to prove he was not imagining it. He walked closer to the back door, and he noticed a smell like bleach and warm metal. A small vent near the foundation blew air, and it carried that smell in short puffs. He leaned down and saw the vent screws were new, bright against dirty siding. Then the scraping stopped, and a hush fell so hard it felt staged. The back door opened a crack, and Maris looked out with her face set. She asked what he was doing, and her tone was sharp enough to cut. Dorian said he heard something and wanted to make sure nobody was hurt. Maris said, "You are not helping. You are making it worse." Before he could answer, the windbreaker man appeared behind her in the doorway shadow. The man held one finger to his lips, then pointed down toward the ground near Dorian. Dorian looked and saw a folded napkin stuck under a crate like it had been tossed. Maris did not notice, or pretended not to notice, and she started to close the door. Dorian stepped back and said he was leaving. Then he turned and picked up the napkin fast. He walked to his van without unfolding it, because he did not want them to see. Inside the van, he opened the napkin and found a short message in shaky block letters. It said, "Do not call the diner, call the highway dispatch." Below that, a second line said, "Ask about the tape from 2016. Dorian sat still for a moment, hearing his own breathing over the idling engine. He did not know what highway dispatch meant, but the fear in the handwriting was clear. He drove 2 miles down the road to a wide turnout, then parked behind a broken sign. He called the county non-emergency line, and the operator transferred him to highway dispatch. He told them he was near a diner and had a safety concern, and he asked about a tape. The dispatcher went quiet, then asked for the diner name and the nearest mile marker. Dorian gave what he could, and the dispatcher told him to stay put and keep the line open. Within 10 minutes, 2 highway patrol units rolled in, then a county deputy behind them. Dorian explained everything, including the flicker, the thumps, and the napkin message. He played the short recording from behind the diner, which captured the yelp and scraping. The deputy listened with a blank face, then asked if Dorian had entered the back hallway. Dorian said no, and the deputy nodded like that mattered more than anything else. The patrol sergeant told Dorian he did the right thing, but his tone sounded rehearsed. They asked him to write a statement, and they took the napkin in an evidence bag. Dorian watched them drive back toward the diner, lights off, moving like they wanted surprise. He stayed in his van as instructed, but he could see the diner sign from the turnout. The sign kept buzzing, and each buzz sounded like a warning he could not translate. A half hour later, the deputy called him back on the same number. The deputy said officers were speaking with staff, and there was no immediate threat found. Dorian asked about the message and the tape from 2016, and the deputy paused. He said, "That is old business, and it is not for you." Dorian asked if someone had written the napkin, and the deputy said no one claimed it. Dorian could have left it there, but the whole thing felt like a trap door opening under him. He drove home with his statement copy on the seat, and he did not tell anyone that night. 2 days later, he got a call from an unknown number, and a man spoke without greeting. The man said, "Stop looking. You got lucky, and luck runs out." Dorian asked who it was, but the line went dead before he got another word out. He did not stop looking, but he looked in ways that stayed inside the lines. He filed a public records request for dispatch logs tied to that mile marker and that date. He also searched old local news archives using the diner name and the year from the napkin. What he found was thin and careful, like someone trimmed the story down on purpose. There was a brief mention of a missing drifter, last seen near the highway in 2016. The article described a backpack found in a ditch and a witness who heard arguing near a diner. It did not name staff, and it did not mention any search of the building. Dorian found a second reference in a scanned weekly paper, and it was even shorter. It said the case was unresolved, and the lead detective had transferred out. No follow-up, no closure, and no reason why a random tech would be warned years later. Dorian remembered the camcorder behind the register, and he wondered who controlled that footage. He drove back in daylight on his next week off, choosing a busy lunch hour for cover. The diner looked the same, but a new handwritten sign said cash, only today. Dorian sat in a booth facing the register, and he watched the camera like it might blink. Maris served him without recognition, or she acted like she did not recognize him. A younger server named Lenka Pruitt refilled his coffee, and she seemed nervous in a different way. Lenka was 24 and worked part-time while taking community college classes in a nearby town. Dorian asked if the diner had been busy lately, and Lenka said it depended on who came in. He asked about the camera, and Lenka said the owner watched everything from home. Dorian asked who the owner was, and Lenka said everyone called him Mr. H. She said she never saw his full name on anything. Dorian asked to use the restroom. Then he walked past the hallway like it was an accident. The mop bucket was gone, but the keypad door was still there, clean and freshly painted. He listened with his ear near the wall, and he heard a low humming like a small motor. It was not like an ice machine. It was steadier, like a fan pulling air through a duct. Dorian backed away when Lenka appeared, and she asked if he was lost. He said he was fine. Then he slipped her a folded receipt with his number written on it. He told her to call if she ever felt unsafe, and he kept his voice calm. Lenka stared at the receipt, then tucked it into her apron without a word. Dorian returned to his booth and finished his food, then left cash and walked out. As he crossed the lot, the windbreaker man from before sat in a different car, watching him again. That night, Lenka texted Dorian from a new number, and she used short, careful sentences. She said the owner paid cash under the table and made staff sign weird policy sheets. She said the back office was off limits, and Maris got angry if anyone even joked about it. Lenka said the humming came and went, mostly at night, and the lights sometimes flickered. She also said Keenan never ate in the diner, and he kept his own food in a cooler outside. Dorian asked if Lenka could photograph the policy sheet, and she said she would try. The next day, she sent 2 blurry photos taken in a restroom mirror for privacy. The paper listed rules about phones, cameras, and talking to law enforcement without permission. One line said any contact with outside agencies had to be reported to management immediately. Dorian felt his stomach tighten because diners did not need rules like that. He took the photos to a friend who worked records at the county courthouse named Sutter Hale. Sutter was 45 and handled filing systems, and he knew which requests to avoid. Sutter said the policy sheet looked like something a private security firm might draft. He also said the diner property had changed hands through an LLC, with layers that hid names. Sutter found one older permit tied to a different business, and it mentioned structural ventilation work. The permit date was 2019, matching what Maris had said about the panel. Dorian asked if Sutter could find the contractor name, and Sutter did, after a long pause. The contractor was a small outfit that did industrial ducting for meat processing plants. That did not fit a diner unless someone needed strong airflow for something heavy. Dorian thought about the bleach smell and the fresh vent screws behind the building. He also remembered the tire tracks and the dent in the back door. Dorian went back to the turnout at night, parking where he could see the diner without being seen. He used a cheap directional microphone, the kind wildlife people used for bird calls. He did not point it at windows, he aimed it at the back lot and the vent area. For an hour, he heard normal sounds, trucks on the highway and whined over gravel. Then, near midnight, the humming began, and it rose into a deeper mechanical note. A vehicle backed into the rear lot, and its reverse beep cut through the desert. Dorian saw taillights, low and close together, like a delivery van with a trailer hitch. The back door opened, and two figures moved something large on a dolly. The shapes were hidden by shadows, but the dolly wheels squeaked in a steady rhythm. Dorian recorded the sound, then he watched the back door close, and the humming intensified. He did not call the diner, because the napkin message had been clear about that. He called highway dispatch again, and he told them a delivery was happening right now. This time the dispatcher asked if he was the man from last week, and Dorian said yes. The dispatcher said units were already staged, and Dorian felt cold hearing that. Within minutes, dark vehicles rolled off the highway without lights, then stopped behind the diner. Dorian could not see what happened behind the building, but he heard shouting carry across the flat land. He heard one sharp bang, then another, and he could not tell if they were doors or something worse. He heard a woman scream once, then a voice yelled, "On the ground, now!" After that, the sounds turned into radio chatter and short commands that blurred together. The diner sign kept buzzing, and it sounded almost cheerful against the chaos. The next day, local news reported a multi-agency inspection that uncovered code violations and an illegal operation. They did not say what the operation was, only that arrests were made and the property was seized. They showed daytime footage of the diner lot, with evidence tape and workers carrying boxes. They did not show the back hallway, and they did not mention any missing person investigation. Dorian read every article he could find, and none of them explained the humming or the vent work. Lenka texted once more, and her message was short and shaky. She said Maris and Keenan were gone, and nobody could reach them, and staff were told nothing. Lenka said officers asked about an old camcorder tape, and they looked angry when it was missing. She said the windbreaker man was not arrested, but he vanished before questions started. Dorian asked if Lenka was safe, and she said she was leaving town that day. A week later, Dorian got his public records request back, and most of it was denied. One page slipped through, likely by mistake, and it was a dispatch summary from 2016. It mentioned a call from a payphone near the diner, reporting a person locked in a storage room. The call ended abruptly, and officers arrived to find the payphone smashed and the diner closed early. The summary said the responding unit noted a new lock on the back hallway door. It also said the diner owner refused a search, claiming no probable cause. That line matched the keypad door, and it matched the way Maris blocked Dorian in the kitchen. The twist was not a secret tunnel or a monster, it was something more ordinary and uglier. Someone had learned that a diner could hide things in plain sight, using noise and grease as cover. The ventilation work was not for comfort, it was to move air through a space nobody could enter. The humming was not an ice maker, it was a fan system tied to that locked room. Dorian still did not know who wrote the napkin, but he believed the windbreaker man helped. Maybe he had been a witness in 2016, or maybe he had been trapped there too. Dorian also did not know where the missing tape went or what it showed in the last minute. He only knew the diner ran like a stage, and staff were cast into roles they could not quit. When the lights flickered, it was not only a bad wire, it was a warning that something was running. Months later, the building sat empty, and the sign was taken down, leaving a pale outline on the wall. Dorian drove past once and saw weeds pushing through the gravel, reclaiming the lot in slow motion. He thought about how normal the breakfast had tasted and how fast normal turned into threat. He thought about Lenka taking photos in a mirror, trying to help without getting caught. He thought about a payphone call that ended mid-sentence and how silence can be engineered. Dorian kept doing refrigeration work, and he kept his head down because that felt safest. When he stopped at roadside places, he looked for keypad doors and fresh paint on old walls. He listened for steady humming that did not match the size of the building. He never told the story like a hero because he did not feel like one. He just felt lucky that a folded napkin landed where he could see it.